Let's talk about first, like in indemnity, whether it's like deductible or tipping basket. Like you can give us the cliff notes.
Yeah. So the broad strokes on indemnity, let's back way up, right? So what is indemnification? In these agreements, you're going to want to negotiate a contractual dispute mechanism, right? The last thing you want is to be in a position post-closing where you're having to litigate issues. It's very expensive. It's just not a very streamlined way to hash out very ordinary course disputes, right? So backing up, so what you do in these transactions is you obviously you conduct due diligence, right? So you want to lift the hood, and you want to take a close look at the business and try to understand everything you can about that business and try to ferret out all the skeletons in the closet. But that's not really practical, right? The sellers, no matter how much diligence you do, the seller's going to know that business better than you are. So, if you push too hard, all you're going to do really is upset them and spend a lot of time and money, and time kills deals. So you need to move fast. And so what you do is you negotiate a set of reps and warranties. And reps and warranties are just a set of statements that the seller is going to make about the business. They're going to tell you that, fundamental stuff like it was properly formed, that they have the proper authorizations, that they own 100% of the equity of the business. And then to some less fundamental things like issues around the contracts and that kind of thing. They make those statements in the contract. And then to the extent that those statements turn out to not be true after closing, you have an indemnification provision that handles breaches of those statements. And oftentimes you'll set aside a bucket of money or an escrow or a holdback to pay for those breaches, right? And there's a number of contractual elements to those mechanisms, or to the bucket of money. You'll have like a healthcare deductible, right? You have to clear a certain amount of money before money starts to come out of the escrow or out of the indemnity generally. You'll have caps saying, this is the maximum amount of the indemnity that's put in place. Some of those deductibles are tipping, right? So once you fill up the deductible or you fill up the basket, which those terms are used interchangeably often, then the basket tips and it goes back to $1. You get paid out $1. So
let's go over an example, because I think this might help, right? So let's say we'll kind of leave like environmental and employment and tax matters to the side, because those are a little bit more complicated. But let's say that there's a representation. Reps is short for representations and warranties. So the seller is saying these things are true, and I'm going to put them in black and white. And one of them is, the financial statements have been true. I've paid all my bills, those kinds of things. Let's say a third-party landlord, after your transaction is done, comes back and says, hey, by the way, your seller didn't pay me 12 months worth of rent, and it's $20,000 a month, and you guys owe me this money. You have to figure it out. And the seller says, well, I disagree. It's not my problem, your problem, or he can evict you. All of a sudden you have a dispute and it's worth $240,000. So if there was a deductible, right, in this case, you would say, hey, look, I'm going to cover, in essence, the first, maybe let's just call it $20,000 worth of issues. I'm not going to come back and nickel and dime you when I found out there was like a late fee on this thing I paid for you that, rolled in the door after we closed. But the deductible in this case is definitely triggered. The cap, right, might be, because this is part of the negotiation back and forth, is that the seller wants to create a limit to their liability. They don't want to have unlimited liability forever out into the future on everything. So if they had negotiated a $100,000 cap on indemnity, then you're having to, in this case, eat $140,000 worth of, lost rent. If there's a tipping basket, like you said, the first, let's say it's a $50,000 tipping basket. The first $50,000, me as the buyer, I'm responsible for. But once we get to $50,001, the basket tips and I'm able to recoup all of that. The seller is paying me back all of that. And it can be held in escrow, which is best case scenario. Or if it's not in escrow, then you got to go find a way to collect from the seller. Is that the general gist?
It is. Yeah. I mean, the idea is the seller wants certainty around how those disputes are going to be handled. I mean, as the buyer, you don't want to be litigating. It's expensive. It's not productive. Same thing for the sell side. So, in a large scale transaction, we'll spend, that's probably one of the two most hotly negotiated areas of the agreement. We'll spend a ton of time there. And then what I see in SMB is there's very little time spent there. And oftentimes there's no indemnification provision at all. Sellers don't understand it, or, sellers look through it and they see very ordinary course stuff like an escrow and they say, we're just going to cross that out, And so the desire to keep it a little bit simpler in SMB.
What about, obviously you guys think primarily about risk mitigation, and risk in this case is usually not, that you buy the company and it doesn't work, right? You fail and the business goes bankrupt. You guys I think are more obviously focused not on the unit economics and the overall strategy of the business, but mitigating the risk around, the situation between buyer and seller devolving, it ending in a lawsuit, it ending in some kind of gridlock. What steps are the kind of, if you had to say, hey, look, these one or two things prevent litigation, prevent a lawsuit, as kind of sellers and buyers think about kind of keeping their side of the street clean?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that's going to prevent litigation is building a good rapport in the sale process. I don't know if that's a legal thing, is building that relationship and having a seller who really sees the buyer as the next generation, and doesn't view it as I'm getting my payday and then I'm out the door. Having that is going to allow us to do what we need to do. If there's risks in the transaction, if there's skeletons in the closet, it can all be mitigated, right? If you've got contingent lawsuits or lawsuits that have been threatened, but you don't tell us about them, we can't protect against that. And then it ends up in litigation and it's a big mess. And so having a well-negotiated purchase agreement that really takes into consideration all of the potential risks of the business is in everybody's best interest. But you have a tendency of sellers to do this.